Good afternoon. Welcome to the NIH Bridge to AI Skills and Workforce Development Lecture Series 2023 and 2024 on large language models. This module consists of total 7 lectures. Today is lecture number 2 for this LLM lecture module. Please join me to welcome Professor Poon, who's the GM of Microsoft Health Futures. He serves his academic position as an affiliated professor at School of Medicine, UW, Seattle. Today, following our large language model lecture last time, Dr. Poon will be presenting Advancing Health at the Speed of AI. Briefly, we are excited to welcome Dr. Poon, who has been a pioneer in biomedical AI research and incubation. He has led a team of investigators working towards the goal of structuring medical data sets, large health data sets, to accelerate discovery and improve delivery for precision health. His team and collaborators are among the very first to explore the application of large language models in health applications, from foundational biomedical research to incubations at large health systems and life science companies. Very exciting projects. Today, we're hoping through his lectures to gain understanding of precision health AI with key applications in real-world data sets and learning about how AI could support health system. Dr. Poon would also explore different technical challenges and share with us what are the research frontiers for the current use of generative AI in health applications. Without further ado, let's welcome Dr. Poon.
Thanks so much, Pepe, and so excited to be here. So let me try to project my screen. So excited to be here and really looking forward, as Pepe mentioned, I want to sort of share a little bit of our progress in applying sort of generative AI to precision health. And so let me see if I can advance. So as we all know, right, in the ideal world, we really like every patient to be able to respond to the treatment they have been given, which is signified by the blue person on the left graph here. But in the real world, many patients actually don't respond to the treatment they have been prescribed, as signified by the red person here. So obviously this leads to a lot of the waste, but also most importantly, the missing of the treatment opportunities. So cancer is really sort of the poster child illustrating these challenges, right? So first generation cancer, people sometimes complaining about them being slash burn and poison. The toxicity is high and efficacy often is quite low. So that leads us to sort of the second gen of targeted therapy. So apology a little bit about the imagery, but on the left, you can see a patient with terminal melanoma with a particular BRAF mutation. And after the patient taken this drug that specifically target this mutant protein domain, we see in the middle that almost miraculously, right, the cancer is melted away with minimal side effect. So that's exactly sort of the dream state we want to be in. Unfortunately, as many of you know, right, cancer has the blessing of natural selection, so eventually figure out how to get around the targeted therapy. So we are far from being done. And most recently, right, the most exciting cutting edge progress obviously is in the immunotherapy. So we are trying to essentially cut off the camouflage pathway for cancer and mobilize the immune system to combat the cancer. So many people believe that this is the way that we can actually finally tame cancer, and because immune system also have natural selection on its side, right? And so here, for example, is a very exciting progress in a drug called Keytruda. That's really a blockbuster success. It has worked miracle on many of the late stage cancer, but unfortunately, overall, it's only worked for like 30-40% of the patient, right? So, and we still far from being knowing sort of like the root cause for that, and also improve over them. So when standard of care doesn't work, right, then the next best thing is to let's try to see whether there is a clinical trial. That usually is the last hope for a patient. So here is a Marty Tannenbaum, who is a successful AI researcher and also also e-commerce entrepreneur. At the peak of his career, he was diagnosed with late-stage melanoma. And now, fortunately for Marty, he mobilized his network that actually was able to find a matching trial that saved his life. So since the cancer episode, Marty completely pivoted his career to helping cancer patients because he correctly recognized that actually most patients don't have the kind of resource like him. So the dream is to have this kind of data-driven continuous learning health system that can instantly incorporate any new information and to optimize care delivery and accelerate biomedical discovery. In fact, the National Academy of Medicine has a series of 15 volumes just talking about this key goal. And one of the key underpinning of this vision is actually real-world evidence, right? Real-world data, which is, and the main idea is actually really simple. There is this population levels scale of routinely collected data, right? From diagnosis to treatment to outcome. And if we can actually distill the insight from that at scale, then we essentially can get this sort of population level scale free lunch. And in fact, regulatory bodies have already been actually actively exploring this as a very promising direction to augment standard trials, right? The challenge, however, in the reality is that a lot of this real-world data is in unstructured form, right? And so the and right now we're basically relying on unscalable manual processing to process them. And in the US, less than 3% of cancer patients were able to find a matching trial, as lucky as Marty. And then on the flip side, a lot of the trial failure actually stem from insufficient getting enough patients in time. And discovery is excruciatingly slow, as a new drug can cost billions of dollars and take over decades. So what's really exciting these days, right, is actually the advent of generative AI that really sort of like start to kind of like bring about new possibilities. In particular, large language model, as we will see a little bit later in the talk, right, can provide what we will call universal structuring capability to help supercharge the structuring problem and instantly unlock a lot of the high-value applications. So this can be likened to essentially what we have been observing in the general domain, right? So what's happening there is that we have this really global scale of digitization of human knowledge in the web, right? Which then enable us to train very powerful large language model that start to revolutionize general software categories. And likewise, in the biomedical domain, in the past couple of decades, there has also been actually fascinating rapid digitization, right? So many of you obviously are super familiar with, like, for example, the genomic sequencing progress, right? So here's contrasting the cost for sequencing a human genome versus the Moore's law, right? If we have to wait for the Moore's law, we have to wait until 2050 for the person genome cost to drop below $1,000. But we actually reached that milestone 10 years ago, right? And there is also another sort of like somewhat understated disruption that happening, which is the digitization of the medical records. Many of us probably have taken that for granted by today, but actually this is only a relatively recent event that only happened in the past decade since the HITECH Act. So with all this digitization in the biomedicine, now imagine if we can unleash the full power of LM on such digital data, we can potentially attain similarly amazing transformation in precision health. So as Pepe mentioned earlier, right, so we are pretty fortunate to be among the first to explore LLMs in health applications. So for example, 3 years ago, we released a PubMed model for biomedical pre-training, language model pre-training, and we are very excited to see actually there is a lot of exciting work coming along this direction. 2 months ago, I saw Pepe and Wei in KDD, right? And I was preparing for a KDD tutorial at that time, and I was a little bit astonished to find out that actually PubMed still get downloaded for about 1 million times a month. But if today you're asking me for PubMed and BioGPT, I will actually point you to GPT-4, which is substantially more powerful. So for example, when you think about Marty's case, right, the challenge for clinical trial matching first and foremost stem from like there is all this elaborate eligibility criteria, right? And but amazingly, with GPT-4, you can basically craft it a very natural instruction. And then it can actually out of box, we're able to already understand all this complex matching logic and parse it for you, structure them for you, right? So this is really, really exciting, and my team literally shouted at me like, you have to see this when they first discovered this. And this happened a lot of time when we start to exploring GPT-4 on a new biomedical health task, right? Now, of course, once you start to put GPT-4 on stress tests, right? Like, for example, all 300,000 trials at ct.gov, then obviously you will start to see a lot of challenges, but still at a high level, right? Like 80-20, like GPT-4 is much more powerful compared to anything we had before, right? Like definitely more powerful than anything I have seen in the past close to 2 decades when I've been working on NLP. So this is very exciting, but as many of you who have worked on clinical trial matching probably know, right, that the bottleneck is actually less on the trial side, but actually more on the patient side, right? So here, for example, is a DID chart showing basically all the clinical notes for a cancer patient. So each bar is actually a note, right? So first thing you notice is that there are many note types, but also there are many notes, right? And also a simple basic core information, like let's say histopathology or maybe staging, right? Frustratingly, like even such as basic information, sometimes you have to synthesize multiple nodes to get one of those information. So in the past, we have been working with collaborators at a large health system like Providence, and we start to make quite a bit of progress using prior generation of large language models like oncology BER that we train with our collaborator on Providence data, right? But what's really exciting these days is that you can actually ask GPT-4 to start doing many of those tasks out of the box. So for example, many of you probably aware that clinical staging could be quite challenging. right? And in particular, the AJCC cancer staging menu have this elaborate criteria about for each cancer type, right? What are the criteria to do the staging? And so what's amazing is that you can pretty much tell GPT-4 to read the menu, right? Like, and then to actually start to perform staging. So you can cram the specification for a cancer type into the prompt as well as the patient information, right? And then GPT-4 out of box almost basically perform as well as the previous supervised state of the art, right? In some cases, even outperform the supervised state of the art. So that's a really, really exciting to see. So now putting all this together, right? This is a demo of our clinical trial matching system with complete synthetic data, right? One thing I want to emphasize is that NLP AI is not going to get to 100% accuracy anytime soon. So we always basically imagining a human-computer symbiosis where the system, AI system, has to explain why it actually makes certain kind of like structuring decision or extraction decision, so that human expert can go in and quickly verify. So we are very excited to see that actually this start to generate some end-to-end impact. So some of you might know that Providence is actually the third largest nonprofit health system in the US, and they start using our research system daily in their tumor board, as well as some of the high-profile trial like the one you have seen here on the right, reported by New York Times. The trial PI, Dr. Ron Lenner, actually described to us at the beginning of the project how painstakingly, right, it used to be for him to essentially spend all his pajama time, right, like scouring the clinical notes and trying to find even a single potential candidate. But now with AI system, he can essentially have all the candidates at fingertip and much more efficiently figure out the recruitment. So clinical trial matching obviously is a very important application in its own right. And it's actually a really exciting kind of beachhead area because it naturally straddles providers and also life sciences company. And then and the same foundational technology can be used to start to tackling some other very high profile applications, right? So for example, many of you are familiar with like a bulk of the costs in drug development, right? Actually stem from this kind of large scale trial. And if you think about it, right, like especially the control arm, right, what it does is trying to tally the sufficient statistic of standard of care. But that actually means that if we can actually sort of like structure the EMR and at population level, then we essentially can get those statistics for free. So this is no longer a pipe dream. So in fact, Flatiron, right? Some of the pioneer like Flatiron already showed that this could work. The only catch right now is that many of these other providers still you have to use essentially an army of human abstractors, right, to try to do this mostly manually. So what's really promising is that can we leverage the LLM's universal structuring capability, as we have seen earlier, right, to start to supercharge all those human experts to turn them into superhuman abstractors, and then instantly unblock and speed up the process. So this is very exciting, but there are many exciting growth areas beyond this, right? So there are many other information-rich modality, such as like for cancer, right? Like you have a lot of radiology images, multi-omics, right? Digital pathologies and so forth, right? And also many of you have probably played with ChatGPT or GPT-4, and you will notice that it actually have quite amazing kind of like capabilities for causal reasonings and so forth. Now imagine if we can unleash all this at the population levels data, then we can potentially help drastically accelerate discovery in precision health. So at a high level, right, all this kind of advance of next generation LLMs, they are not really here just like the first generation foundation model, right, to basically give you some improvement for a single task and so forth, right? Actually, what's really exciting is that they actually enable completely new approach to emerge, right? Setting new patterns, right? So one thing we have talked about is the universal structuring for scaling real-world evidence generation. But you can also use GPT-4, for example, as a universal translator, right? So it can literally translate from English to Chinese and English to French and so forth. But it can also translate among different ontologies, biomedical ontologies, right? Like OMOPS, FHIR, and so forth. And that actually have a major implication how we can think about the next generation interoperability, right? And as you will see some example later, right, like GPT-4 can also serve as a universal annotator, right? So out of the box, it's already being pretty smart in evaluating the correctness of a particular extraction task or generation task, right? So that could have actually major implication for how we can in the future to create benchmark at scale, right? To also kind of like like scaling up real sort of like evaluations and so forth, right? And finally, the most exciting part actually about GPT-4 is that you shouldn't treat it as kind of like the source for the ultimate truth, right? So, but it is a very, very amazing reasoner, right? So what you can do is that you can ask GPT-4 not to conjuring up answer from its memory, right? But instead, right, basically help you to synthesize the data and knowledge that you trust, right? So point it to your data store and your knowledge sources, and then try to make sense of all of them, try to synthesize all of them. So that's a really, really exciting part. So now what is it in for the patient, right? So for example, right now there are already millions of patients who have taken a checkpoint inhibitor and other immunotherapy. Now, if we can collect all those information and try to figure out the exception responder versus a non-responder, then we can potentially figure out better companion diagnosis, as well as like uncovering, right, some of the potential mechanism why it doesn't respond in some cases, and then start to see whether we can improve, right? And of course, the idea, right, of real-world evidence and unlocking all this real-world observational data is not new, right? But in the past, we are mostly constrained in leveraging the structure side of the equation, right, like claim data and so forth, right? But what's really exciting with the generative AI revolution is that we can potentially tap into all these kind of dark matters of unstructured data, which have much higher granularity and volumes, right? So in the end, right, of course, technology can only be a small part, right, in any sort of like end-to-end sort of like transformation. And what we need is to actually help the entire ecosystem, right, to be able to actually scaling the real-world evidence generation more efficiently. But here, generative AI and LLM can actually serve as a pretty important role as pretty much like a spark or catalyst, right? That can actually change the ROI, right? So that make something that yesterday was infeasible, right? Like human curation, for example, right? Hard to scale to millions and millions of cancer patients, but now today potentially become plausible, right? And that could actually essentially start to make a lot of transformation become the reality. And at a high level, right, what's also super exciting is that what happened at a high level is really that can we actually using generative AI to empower everyone with a valuable data store to turn it into a discovery engine, right? So that's the really exciting future. So all these are quite promising, but there are tons of challenging ahead, right? We are far from being actually solving all the problems. In fact, it's just the beginning of the journey. And a lot of these challenges can boil down in precision health, right? Boil down into two main questions, right? So does the treatment work, right? So is it safe, right? And when you think about at the grand scheme of things, right, real-world data can provide crucial evidence to answer those questions. And also, as we mentioned earlier, human in the loop is key to help mitigate the risk and also continue helping the AI system to improve. So here I would basically quickly touch upon a few kind of like really exciting research frontiers, right? So first of all, obviously, how do we harness generative AI, like something like GPT-4, right? So many of you are pretty familiar with prompt engineering. It's a little bit like Harry Potter stuff, right? You need to figure out the exact spellings and so forth. And it's maybe a little bit worse than Harry Potter magic, right? So over there, you assume the magic actually doesn't change over time, right? The spell still work 50 years later, right? So, but here actually, a lot of those tricks and practice actually can be evolved over time, right? And also prompt engineering is actually just a small part of the whole picture, because what's really exciting these days is that the entire programming paradigm have been changing, right? So you can now have a domain expert, right, who never learned about C++, Python, and so forth. They don't. They can now actually instantly start to do programming, right, by natural languages, right, like English or Chinese, right, and so forth, right? And that's basically opened up tons of exciting possibility, but also presenting a lot of challenges, and which actually require us to completely rethink the entire programming paradigm, right? So there are many exciting research frontiers that many of you are probably super familiar with, like retrieval augmented generation, like how to use tool, but more generally, how do we do orchestration, right? How could we harness sort of a agent system of a number of LLMs and so forth. So here I would just quickly touch on point one, actually exciting aspect, which is that can we use LLM to fact check itself, right? As a universal annotator to actually go back to check the homework, right? So you might be wondering why this is possible, right? So like, how can GPT-4 catch an error that it just made earlier, right? So here, actually, the underlying reason is actually quite simple, right? When you do generation, when you try to answer a question in the first place, you are doing a much harder search problem, like predicting next token, next token, next token. That's like exponential search problem, right? Verification, on the other hand, you already have the utterance at hand, and you just need to determine, okay, is this actually the correct one, right? And so forth. So this is a little bit akin to CS 101, like P versus NP, and so which is why this is actually possible, right? So let me give you actually one example, right? It's a little bit of a toy example, but it can help illustrate the methodology, right? So imagining you have a discharge summary, a pretty long one, right? Like let's say 20,000 words and so forth, right? And then you said, hey, can I gather all the problem lists, right? And no matter how you engineer a prompt, chances are that you probably cannot get it right in first try. But why do you need to do that? You don't have to do that, right? So what you can do is that you can come up with a reasonably natural prompt, right, to do the 80-20, but then you don't have to stop there. What you can do is that you can ask GPT-4 to go back and say, hey, here's a disease, right, that you just identify, and can you find out what's the provenance, right? Why do you think this is actually a disease mentioned, right? And then conditioning on the evidence, right? Can you actually double check it, right? Like, do you still think that's actually the right thing? And this can potentially cut down on a lot of the hallucination and precision error, but you also don't have to stop even there, right? You can say, okay, conditioning all these diseases, don't show them again, but can you find other things, right? So in this way, you can actually keep looping to find omission error. So here's one real example from the identified nodes, right? So the first try actually is quite good, get a bunch of disease, but it's far from being done, right? So when you ask it again, it actually were able to find some new ones. And for each one, it actually were able to generate the provenance, and then and actually to double check. And for example, in this case, on second thought, it said, okay, well, this could be pneumonia, could be something else. So it actually rule out by itself, and human expert can chime in to either agree or disagree, right? You can keep going. So in this case, for example, again, mostly correct, but then for endocarditis, on the verification step, it actually finds out, oh, this is actually rule out, so that's actually shouldn't be included. So amazingly, by just doing this very simple exercise, then GPT-4 by itself can actually already eliminate quite a bit of error by itself. And then in general, what's really exciting is that can we come up with this kind of so-called self-improving, right, human LLM kind of agent framework, so that we can maximally utilize the very precious human bandwidth, and then using multiple LLM instances, right, to actually self-improving and then drastically augment the human expertise. So far, we talk about using GPT-4 out of the box, right? And indeed, they can actually be quite have quite impressive functionality. So, for example, here's one use case like, can you extract the adverse drug event from biomedical text, right? You can see out of the box, it actually can do pretty well, but still there is a major gap from the supervised data. So another really interesting thing you can use LLM is that you can use them as a noisy teacher, right? For example, in this case, and we can ask GPT-3, right, to say, here are 50 PubMed abstracts, right? So annotate those abstracts, create those self-supervised labels, and then using that to fine-tune a much smaller model, let's say PubMed, right? And amazingly, that by just doing this simple exercise, that the smaller the model that is 1,000 times smaller, right, not only can actually recapitulate a lot of those knowledge, right, but actually outperform the teacher, right, and already get very close to the supervised data. Now, of course, in general, you don't want to do this for every single task, right? So there are gazillion tasks that you might want to tackle. But what we could do is to basically categorize those tasks into a few big general task classes, right? And then you can start doing this distillation for each classes, let's say universal structuring, universal summarization, and so forth, right? So that will overall make it much more tractable. And also the distill model, because it doesn't have to handle every single other things, so they can often perform actually better than the original teacher, right? So we did some baby step, for example, using the very simple task class of name entity recognition, right? So for example, in UMLS, you can find over 1 million entities, right? So, and in general domain, there are even more, right? So can you actually create a universal NER system that can actually tackle all those entities without requiring a lot of supervised data, right? So what we find out is that actually using GPT-3 as the noisy teacher, we can actually distill student model much a fraction of the size, but actually perform much better, right? So that's exciting, but ultimately what we want to do is to turn all those structured real-world data, right, into a discovery engine. Now, as many of you are well known, right? So observational data major drawback is that there could be a lot of confounders, right? So what we have been starting exploring is a general framework that we call trial scope, right? Initially motivated by trial simulation using real-world data, right? So this is a relatively busy slide, but the main idea is actually really simple, right? So we start with LM on the top left, right, to structuring the patient data at scale. Now there need to be sort of like some cleansing, right? So we introduce some principal probabilistic approach to do imputation and error correction. Then once you have a relatively clean structured data, then you can couple with essentially the clinical trial matching engine, right? So then for any hypothesis you care about as expressed in eligibility criteria, you can assemble the virtual cohort by snapping a finger, right? Now, most crucially is that once you got this virtual cohort, right, you don't want to use it as is, but actually to start incorporating state-of-the-art, causal methods to alleviate the confounders. So for example, first you can see that actually LLM by the universal structuring actually can drastically increase the sample size, right? So for example, even for sort of well represented attribute like cancer event, right, in structured data, right, there are actually more things you can find in the free text, and combining together, you can get a lot more patients, right? For some other information like ECOG for health status, right, you pretty much cannot get anything from the structured data, so you have to rely on the unstructured data. And then similar for drug treatment information, right? And then you can also see that how by applying causal correction, it can actually have a substantial improvement. So for example, here each bar underneath is actually a trial, right? Marquis lung cancer trial. And then the bar basically signify if you use a naive, if you use a simulation, right, what is the hazard ratio that you get compared to the published hazard ratio, right? So, and the blue bar is basically if you don't do any correction, right? And then the orange bar is that after you do the causal correction, you can see in many cases, actually, the causal correction can drastically reduce the disparity, right? So that's quite promising. And then, in fact, we find out that overall, it can actually simulate many of the marquee lung cancer trial very well, including, for example, this original Keytruda trial. For some of the failed trial, we can also actually simulate them pretty nice. In general, this is obviously just barely scratching the surface, right? Once you can do simulation of trial, you can start to apply that to external control, post-market surveillance, and all that, right? And this opened up a lot of possibilities in precision health discovery. So finally, I want to conclude by highlighting a particularly amazing growth area for GPT-4 on this kind of next generation LLMs, right? And that is the multimodal longitudinal patient data area, right? So we are not going to get a whole lot of that in the public web, right? So which means that actually maybe not any, right? So which means that a lot of this kind of general domain LLM, that's actually a big growth area. So why would this matter, right? So like here's one example. So why do some of those patients don't respond to the immunotherapy, right? It's widely believed that the tumor microenvironment play a big role, and something like tumor-infiltrated lymphocyte, right? How the immune cell interact with the tumor cell. And right now, that information mostly can only be found in, for example, digital pathology images, right? So now, if you put actually general domain, let's say you ask a stable diffusion models, right? What is a lung CT scan? It will actually draw you glowing lung, right? So that basically it doesn't know what it means by CT, but if you can, but it actually is teachable, right? It by giving just a small amount of data and compute, you can start to get it to get the hang of it, right? So now a general way that you're teaching extending those general domain multimodal model is basically using this very common recipe, right? So, and the key here is actually the projection layer, right? That you try to project the other modality, like for example, imaging, right? You try to project the vision encoding into the text domain, right? To basically to map them into comparable text tokens. Now, in this way, then you can start to enable multimodal conversation, right? Arbitrary sort of like applications, right? So, and here the key here, obviously, right? Besides from the choice of those modules, right? Like the vision encoder, text decoder, is actually the instruction following data. How can you generate a large scale of this kind of data, right? To teach the large multimodal model to be able to actually map those additional modality into the text space, right? And B, learn how to reason about them together, right? So we start to, with our collaborator, we start to have this very exciting recent work called Lava Met, right? So basically it's a tiny baby step towards this direction to try to take a step. Now, the basic idea is actually quite simple, right? So first, we try to get some free lunch, right? So what we try to do is to extract a bunch of biomedical image and text pair from biomedical research papers, right? Specifically from the figure and the caption, right? So we generate this arguably probably the largest public biomedical image and text data set, right? From public sources, 46 million pairs. And then given each pair, right? So let's say you have image and also the corresponding description, right? Now, by itself, this doesn't actually give you the instruction following data yet, right? But this is where GPT-4 can actually come to the rescue, right? So by basically, let's ignore the image for a second, right? To ask GPT-4, hey, here is the goal description. Can you generate a plausible conversation about this goal description, right? Amazingly, GPT-4 can actually do it quite well. And now you can add back the image. So now you have the triple, right? The image, the instruction or the question, and then the answer, right? So, and then you, in this way, you can almost generate almost infinite, right? Like obviously bounded by your compute, right? So, and in our initial exploration, like we only basically use like a small percentage of the plausible data, and much more can be done. So we are very excited to see that actually this had generated quite a bit of interest, followed by a number of exciting work afterwards. And all of this work, again, they follow the common recipe to learn this projection layer to translate the different modality into text, right? But then one of the direction we try to push on is to actually harness this GPT-4's amazing capability to essentially create this kind of multimodal instruction following data, right? And with our UW collaborator, for example, we have also explored a little bit tiny baby step on the single cell domain. And with our clinical collaborator at Providence, we have digitized all the pathology slide for cancer and retrieve a lot of legacy radiology images. And now we really start to try to tackle some of this potential moonshot, right? And there are some very table stake baby step, but most recently, as of even this week, we start to get a ton of exciting new results. So very exciting. And now to conclude, right? So we can think about sort of like one of the biggest growth area for GPT-4 or in the future next generation LLM, right? This longitudinal multimodal patient data. Now, imagining if we can learn how to tackle those longitudinal multimodal to be able to embed them into the same space of the text, right? And then essentially start to exploring, like, is there any new health scaling laws, right? Are there any new emerging health capabilities, right? If a large language model have actually seen so many diagnosis, treatment, outcome information, can it actually be very smart in discerning a lot of the potential connection, right, that we have so far haven't been able to discern, right? So so thank you, and I want to acknowledge my team who have done all this work, right? And also all our amazing collaborators without whom we obviously can't do any of this. Thanks very much, and looking forward to the discussion.
Wonderful talk. Okay, we're gonna open it up for Q&A. If anyone in the audience have Q&A, please add it to the Q&A now. But I'd like to start us off with a question, if that's all right. So my question is, can you comment on using knowledge graphs, storing factual knowledge for reducing hallucinations of large language models? And could these maybe be used in conjunction with the self-checking mechanism to further refine the knowledge graph?
Absolutely. That's already my favorite question now. So one thing I sort of alluded to earlier, right, is like you don't want to rely on GPT-4 to conjure things up from its memory, right? You actually can say, hey, GPT-4, don't trust your memory, right? What I want to use is your amazing conversational capability, so you understand what I want, but also the amazing reasoning capability to synthesize information, right? So then in particular, you can point it to your favorite knowledge graph, right? And then said, hey, this is the knowledge store. Can you actually reason conditioning on this knowledge graph, what will be the answer to the question, right? You can also even imagining combining both knowledge graph and also data, right? So like here are the new, high throughput, I don't know, like single cell or whatever data, right? So how should I interpret them in the presence of the knowledge that I trusted, right? And yeah, absolutely.
Thank you. Okay, we have our first question by Disha. Would like to know your inputs on using digital phenotyping real-world data for mental health diagnosis and support.
Yeah, so I would say that a lot of our work, right, from the beginning, really sort of like motivated by the progress in the Human Genome Projects early on, right, 10 years ago, 12 years ago when I started in MSR, Microsoft Research, when I decided to jump into this, that's a lot of our early motivation. So, and also that's also a disruptive moment for cancer genomics and so forth. So lots of impact opportunity. So a lot of our current work focusing on oncology. We start to dabble a little bit into autoimmune disease, right? Fascinating challenges since COVID and other, like IBDs and so forth, right? And obviously we always keep an eye out for a rare disease. But if I have like sort of like opportunities to start thinking about new disease, that would definitely be mental health, right? So and I think there is a lot of great opportunity in several fold. One is like maybe some of the potential therapeutic area, right? That's a really hardest to scale, right? We never have enough therapists. Like that could be an area where can we start to explore using this very smart kind of conversational agent, right? And then obviously you need to worry about the hallucination and other things. But if we can put all those in within a good guardrail, that can potentially scale the therapeutic space dramatically, right? And then when you also think about like imaging, right? So far I talk about like digital pathology for cancer, but then obviously like for a lot of the neural disease and so forth, right? There were other kind of imaging modality, like, and one of the big challenge as far as I understand, right? Caveat is that I'm totally a layman there, but it's very hard to quantify, right? So some of this kind of mental health and all this disease, and can we actually turn them much more quantitative, right? To be able to measure them, precisely define them, and then start to explore treatment. So I think in both avenue, I can see lots of potential. Thanks.
Great. Our next question is from Lawrence. Is there a general research paper URL link for this presentation?
General research paper, no. There are many papers. In fact, like I have a stack of paper that I become the bottleneck in writing. And so maybe one single place I can point you guys to is we just gave a KDD tutorial in August, right? And so if you go to my LinkedIn or somewhere, you should be able to find that we actually post our slide deck there. And so that probably is, I was like that would be probably one place where you can find a lot of this kind of directions. Yeah.
And the next question is from Jake Chen. There are many errors in EHR, and there's less ground truth in medical diagnosis, and treatment can be quite varied. How can you train health LLM that can universally apply to all populations?
This is another big contestant for my favorite question for the day. So it actually touched on several aspects, right? So let me try to tease them apart, right? So one question obviously is like perhaps sort of like the generalizability question, right? So because like different institutions may have some of their own favorite practice or maybe naming convention and all that, right? So there is obviously like any machine learning system, you need to worry about generalizabilities and so forth. One thing that we pretty lucky, for example, in some of our collaborators like Providence, right? They are actually a very big diverse health system, right, spanning big urban center as well as rural hospitals, 27 cancer center, if I remember the number right? And so so there we can already do a lot of using ML hygiene, right, to start to actually testing the generalizability quite rigorously, and so far the results are quite promising. I think another question you hinted on is like the noise in the data, right? So and for example, one big challenge when you compare to like ground truth clinical trials, right? Well, not ground truth, but at least the gold standard, right, in clinical trial. The quality of the data collection there, right, is a lot more rigorous, and obviously the quality is a lot higher, right? Now, the flip side of that is that you need to pour a lot of resource, which means that it's not sustainable for everyday practice. So then you are left with this real world data, right, that sometimes is not, you know, at the same quality, of course, right? So here, one of my high-level thinking, right, is that we are mostly using that as a discovery engine, right? So we are not trying to say, hey, here's a real-world data, and then we definitively prove that this drug can work, right? Oftentimes you cannot do that. But what you can do is that to say, hey, based on the current data, right, this hypothesis is very likely, right? Because we always have way more hypotheses than we can feasibly test, right? So then even doing this hypothesis kind of like prioritization, oftentimes can already generate tons of values, right? And then there are also a lot of the places where real world data can reach to a much bigger population, right? Talking about sort of like underserved, underrepresented population, this is actually something that RWE can potentially help address. And then there are also potential way that you could actually enrich those medical data, right? So I hinted at some of the way that you can look into, like, what if I have conflicting piece of information in the notes and so forth, right? And also, like, for example, another example would be like RECIST criteria, right? So then sometimes the radiology report may already capture some of the basic information, right? And then normally in trial, what you do is that you hire expert, right, to look at like, oh, how many lesions, where anyone grow bigger or smaller, right, and so forth. Then you determine, oh, is it a stable disease, is it partial response and complete response and so forth. But in real world practice, right, you can hardly do that at scale at all, right? But that's actually another place when AI can come in to at least partially sort of like, you know, scale this problem so that you don't need like a million expert to do that, right? And then I think probably the last aspect you point out is like potential like clinical errors, right? So if we learn sort of garbage in, garbage out, right? So if we learn from like poor practice, wouldn't we just replicate or even amplify them? That's a great point, right? So one thing I actually are thinking, this is just thinking aloud, right? But one thing that's actually what real world data can actually give you some way to, in fact, to potentially discern some of those errors, right? And uncover some of those growth opportunity, because you not only just see the diagnosis, right? You can actually see the long-term outcome. And the long-term outcome often is unambiguous, right? So yes, the diagnosis, actually many experts may not agree with each other, right? But then the long-term outcome, right, like that result actually speak for itself. So there are actually an opportunity by leveraging that at the population level scale that we can maybe uncover some of the growth area in the clinical practice and so forth. So like, can we tie this to like value-based cares and so forth, right? So this is obviously very, very exciting.
Great. Our next question is an anonymous question. In biomedicine, when do you choose to use an LLM trained only on biomedical texts such as PubMed BERT versus a general purpose LLM like GPT-4?
Yeah, absolutely. So I would say that there are several different considerations, right? So one is like, I will start with the capability angle first, right? So if you don't have any other constraint, right, what is the strongest, most powerful LLM that you might want to use? And so that I would say hands down, right, it will be this kind of generalist model like GPT-4. And the reason is that it doesn't only see a lot of, like, it definitely have seen all those 30 million PubMed abstracts, right? But it actually also seen tons of other biomedical content, right? Like all the WebMD, all your podcasts and so forth, right? All the, you know, kind of like documents, medical related document. But beyond that, right? you would say, hey, wouldn't this generalist, like why it would be helpful to read a bunch of like Harry Potter's book, right, to begin with, or other things, right? Why would that be helpful to medicine, right? Now, one thing that's actually pretty amazing, and we are still at the beginning to understand all this, most of the thing I would say is still a mystery, right? It's like through this kind of very generalist studying, right? Like pretty much indistinguishably reading everything in the web, right? And the LM like GPT-4, right, actually acquires several capability. That's what people call emerging, right? So those are like things that you have to read big enough, like wide enough, and have a large enough model capacity, right, to acquire those capabilities, right? So one emerging capability is this amazing conversational capability, right? So that's something that PubMedBird cannot do. BioGPT can do very preliminarily, right? So and so GPT-4 can really understand a lot of the concepts and so forth. You can have misspelling, typos, or what have you, right? And it understands to a very large extent what you mean and what you want, right? So that's one. The other one is this amazing reasoning capability, right? So a lot of early training of GPT-4 actually start from code, right? Starting from like, for example, the GitHub, right? Like when you have code and you have human comments, right? So actually, amazingly, that initial training, right, actually equipped the GPT-4 with a lot of amazing reasoning capabilities, right? And so back to your question, I would say that a few years ago, right, when we are sort of really strapped into, really limited by the model size and the compute kind of bandwidth, right? In that very context, then training much more domain specific, you essentially prioritize the bandwidth just for biomedical, right? And in that setting, it makes sense, right? But now that you already have this very powerful generalist model, then by default, like that is strictly more powerful. Now, there may be some kind of like situation where you are very cost sensitive, right? Or maybe you really need a white box access to start to get general explanation, understand debuggings, and so forth. There may be those pragmatic cases, right? And then another cases would be like the multimodal space, right? That the GPT the generic model may not be so well, right? So but still, like all those foundational emerging capability like conversation, reasoning, and all those, right? It's very hard to get it just by training on domain specific tasks.
Okay, our next question is from Eric Rosenthal. Can you talk about the privacy risks of sharing significant text corpus as part of the multimodal data from our projects within the broader community? Are there ways to federate this work?
Yeah, absolutely. So first of all, I want to make sure that make it clear that so far all of our work, right, involving like patient data, they are strictly in our collaborators tenant, right? So for example, Providence, all the patient data are covered by the IRB, and it's strictly within their firewall in their private instance. And so we basically credential as their vendor to go in, right, to collaborate with them to actually do all those learning. So that can be quite productive when you start with some single institute, right? But as the question alluded to, like ultimately, like let's say eventually every disease is a rare disease, right? Like, can we do patient like me at population level scale? Can we really jack up the power for a lot of rare conditions? That can only happen, right, when the society come together to figure out a way for all this institute to break the data silo in one way or the other, right? So, and federated is one paradigm that have been quite fruitful already in some of the cases, but I would argue that the more fundamental challenge is actually to figure out, to justify to the society why we are doing this exercise, right? Why we are doing this potential trade-off, right? And where is the benefit, where is the risk, right? How like the society need to be concerned, right? And buy into this effort. And then the individual stakeholder, we need to also, as a society, sort out the incentive structure, right? Because otherwise, then the different competing provider may not have incentive to share the data and so forth. So how can we reconcile that problem, right? So I would say that federative and as anything could be useful, but technology in any case could be just one small bit of that, and there are much larger societal question that we need to tackle.
Okay, we have an actual follow-up question from Eric Rosenthal as well. Also, can you comment on time series physiology? These are not structured like language, they're more stochastic than narrative. Do you have experience with the time series data to be integrated into LLM workflow as per your image example?
Yeah, we actually have a paper we just submitted and which is basically looking into leveraging the temporal images and reports, right? And to be able to do what I would call counterfactual image generation, right? So imagining you have a patient with a chest X-ray taken 6 months ago, and then now you have some description about the disease progressions and so forth. What would the new image look like, right? So something like that. So it's one of my a personal favorite project recently, but that's just a very small example of this, what I mean by longitudinal. That's exactly what you talk about as a time series, right? So and there is a lot of open like at every single scale, right? Like even within, for example, image like CT or MRI, you already have almost like video kind of like property. But when you think about the temporal evolution, right, of a patient and all the sensor data and so forth, that's, I would say that's a holy grail, right? If we can be able to capture those time series, capture those logic, that's what I mean by the neural scaling law and the emergent capability, right? So if we actually were able to map those multimodality into this kind of like sequence, right, of tokens, and can we uncover a lot of the properties there? And many of them, like the question suggested, could be very different from the auto-regress property in the text alone, right? So that would be actually super exciting. I don't know the answer, and I hope that we can collectively try to find out.
Okay, our next question is from Max. How many companies have the resources to develop an LLM? Is this a technology that only a few will be able to develop or control? Or will LLMs be available more broadly in the near future?
Yeah, absolutely. Like even like last year at just the beginning when the ChatGPT was released, right? Like one thing that I point out to my team is like LLM actually will be democratized, right? Very soon, right? Like commoditized, what have you. And the reason is that like a lot of this technological progress, right? Obviously like they are all of them are public, right? And also like over time, right? The compute and all that the cost will decrease, right? So in fact, you already have seen a lot of the great work like come from Meta, for example, like the Llama theory series, right? But also many of the other open source model like Falcons and so forth, right? That already provide a very solid foundation to actually start exploring, like put LM into everyone's hand. So I think like and also if you think about like GPT-4, right, that's already widely available as a service, right, on Azure and also from OpenAI. So I think like the LLM access is going to be democratized and commoditized. Now, that's mostly about inference, right? Those mostly about the model, and then can you query the model, run the model. When you think about training, obviously, maybe that's partially behind the question, is like that's still a much higher bar, right, in terms of computation and so forth. So that indeed, I think for maybe a short period of time, right, there will still be some kind of like bottleneck, but you can still, you already see, like, for example, especially in the multimodal domain, right, that's lots of low-hanging fruit. You can already see a lot of open source exploration, so I don't see that the access will be actually monopolized or overly restricted.
Great. The next question is from Will. Do you have any advice for the best forums to stay up to date on the state-of-the-art topics you mentioned today?
Yeah, I wish I know the answer myself. So when I just started as a grad student many years ago, maybe 2 decades ago, right? It's life seemed to be simple, right? So you have a few conferences, right? Like at that time, like for me, like Triple AI is one of the go-to, and then a couple NLP conference and a couple ML machine learning conference. First of all, conference start to multiply, right? Especially when you go to interdisciplinary area, right? And also the progress these days goes so fast that actually you don't have to, you can't wait for the conference. You have to keep track of the archive, right? So there are actually some Twitter account that they're specifically watching out what are the interesting and apply some editorial source filtering and start posting interesting papers, right? And there is a archive sanity site. So that's just a long-winded answer to say that it's a universal problem at this point. It's exciting because progress is so fast, but also intimidating because the progress is so fast, right? I personally benefit a lot, for example, in a few sources, like essentially think about them as free lunch from crowdsourcing, right? So like social media this day become quite useful. Like I used to really love Twitter because I can go there and basically get all the latest and greatest in scientific news. It deteriorated a little bit, unfortunately, but still reasonable good source. LinkedIn increasingly become, actually, I also start to find some good paper provided who you follow, right? And in general, I have a lot of friends who come to me and say, hey, have you seen this paper? What do you think? They thought they are actually leveraging my not expertise, but actually they are helping me to learn about all those new works. So they just don't know about that. So and on that front, I'm actually particularly enjoying, like, for example, talking to our interns, right? Like in general, talking to students, young researcher, because they actually seem to know every new things, right? And just by talking to them, so very long-winded answer is just like there is no perfect way to do it. I lean on a lot of crowdsourcing, and I also imagine at some point, right, we can really harness some of these large language models, start doing that. One small bit these days I use is the Edge browser, right? So I'm now an unapologetic user of Edge because it has this great functionality that you can put a PDF, you can summarize it, ask GPT-4 to do it, right? So.
Okay, our next question is from Robert. Is there a reference that you can provide for construction of knowledge graph and pair this with LLM?
Construct a knowledge graph in what? In what with LLM?
And to pair it with use with the large language model.
Oh, I see. I don't have one top of mind yet. Partially because I think the some of the classic knowledge graph, right? So a while ago, we also worked a little bit on knowledge graph embeddings and so forth. Some of those, like pretty classic prior generation knowledge graph, you will argue that actually GPT-4 already have a lot of that absorb a lot of that, right? I think it's actually interesting to think about sort of like what are the potential knowledge graph, right, that GPT-4 cannot easily have already read from PubMed or other places, right? Maybe the latest stuff and maybe some of the proprietary knowledge and so forth. And so, yeah, so short answer is that I have seen some result to show that GPT-4 actually can already can, you know a lot of stuff in the existing many of those knowledge graph. But where is the places where now, of course, there are also other research where mostly in the retrieval augmented generation domain, right? That's probably where you can find some instances where you can essentially augment GPT-4, right, using the RAG over some large knowledge graph or data store, right? I would say the whole area is still in flux, in infancy, right? And where is the places where knowledge graph can particularly augment LM? I truly believe there definitely will be opportunity, and the question is to find some of those low-hanging area.
Okay, we are already 10 minutes past the hour. Maybe we can do one last question if that's all right.
Yeah, sure.
Okay, the last question by an anonymous attendee. There are gaps, including a lack of standardized clinical assessment tools and evidence-based management strategies for Lewy body disease, as well as difficult and controversy in diagnosing this disease. Any suggestion on tackling this challenge?
Yeah, I would say that actually absent that particular disease, right, which I don't know much about, I would say, but that statement still hold true, right? When I first react to the beginning of the language sequence, right, I would say that actually someone asked me, okay, what's the most important thing in Gen AI that I think about these days? Maybe a little bit counterintuitive. I actually said it should be evaluation, right? So I would say that that's actually in general a really important part to invest in. Think about how do we translate some of this real world use case into formalized problem formulation. But more importantly is that we can actually curate a data set for evaluation, for annotation, and then at real time can actually evaluate them, right? And a lot of time, obviously, the bottleneck is the human expertise in both annotation, but sometimes more importantly for complex tasks, like how do you actually evaluate at scale? Those are really challenging. So I would say that's actually, in general, really challenging, but probably the foundation for a lot of Gen AI application. I would point out maybe one thing, again, I can't specifically comment on any of the disease reference, but I would say there is one direction I feel very passionate about, I highlight in the talk, right? Which is like, we can use the GPT-4 and many of this next gen LLM, right, to help accelerate this kind of benchmark evaluation creation. And the reason is that they can serve as an 80-20 very smart assistant, right? And then if you can actually incorporate the self-verification, incorporate human in the loop, right, that can turn into a very powerful way to basically iterate on the evaluation part. Yeah. Sorry for the non-answer answer.
Okay, thank you very much. I think we'll call it there today.
Awesome.
Thank you, Professor Poon. That was amazing. Thank you, all of you, for joining us today. And the video recording of this outstanding lecture will be available either by the end of today or tomorrow at the latest at the website for the Bridge to AI Skills Workforce Development links. Talk to you all again next time.
Thanks for having me. Very excited to be here.